Most of you probably know that there's a new Dungeon Master's Guide coming out next month. Wizards sent me an early access PDF last week, undoubtedly because they saw that I'd finally gotten around to reading the 2014 one and didn't want me to gain any ground. So just to spite them, I've read all 384 pages already. Take that, Wizards. I have to say, having so recently read the entire 2014 DMG, I am in a prime position to compare the two books. And you know what? I really like it. Honestly, a lot of the new stuff that's in here now, I feel like I could have written myself. It's so in line with my philosophy on DMing and the kind of advice that I offer on this channel. Now, I know that people tend to be much more suspicious of positive opinions than of negative ones, but I want to be really clear here. Wizards of the Coast did not sponsor this video, and they definitely didn't pay me under the table to talk up their books or whatever the latest conspiracy theory is. As exciting as it would be to live the kind of life where I'm getting into a black Escalade in a Denny's parking lot to receive a briefcase full of cash and a PDF on an unmarked flash drive, it is, unfortunately, much more boring than that. Nobody paid me to talk about this book, and I couldn't care less whether you buy it or not, but this is huge news in the world of D&D, where I both work and play, so I'm gonna talk about it. Now, there's plenty to deep dive on in future videos, but today I want to keep it top level and talk through the most fundamental changes compared to the 2014 DMG. In my opinion, those changes fall into 5 main categories: tracking sheets, encounter balance, ready-made game elements, bastions, and the lore glossary. We'll start with tracking sheets. This is a set of 9 worksheets, mostly DM-facing, that have been added periodically throughout the book. The intention is that you'll photocopy these sheets and use them in some kind of campaign binder. I've always been the kind of nerd who was excited to go buy new school supplies, so I feel what some would call an unwholesome excitement for a good worksheet. But whether or not these are good worksheets really depends on which one you look at. Some of them I love and will definitely be using. For example, the first one you come to is Game Expectations. This is basically a very lightweight Session 0 worksheet. You guys know I'm one of those blue hair and pronouns snowflakes who love Session 0. I mean, that's why I always carry a sword, just in case someone doesn't respect my boundaries. So you won't be surprised to hear that I'm really glad this was included. I'm all for normalizing clear, open discussions about expectations and boundaries, and a worksheet like this is a good tool for it. Some parties are gonna want more detail than this sheet provides, but I think this is a very approachable option for parties who might be new to Session 0. I also really like the travel planner. In this chapter, they've introduced the concept of travel between locations being laid out into 3 stages. So many DMs set up travel as a single stage in between 2 locations, which can be super boring. You leave the town, you travel through the forest, you arrive at the destination. Imagine if Tolkien did that. Lord of the Rings would be a lot shorter. But breaking it up into you take the caravan road, then you enter the forest, then you cross the canyon, just gives you a lot more to work with. The worksheet is broken up into these 3 stages, and each one prompts you to write down where it starts and ends, the distance that stage covers, what type of terrain it is, and what the weather is like. Then there's a section to write down how many days or hours this stage will take if the party is traveling fast, normal, or slow. And finally, there's space for narrative notes and challenges. I love this structure, especially because I tend to do too much prep in some areas and completely ignore others, so having a clear, simple foundation like this will make sure that I know the basics before I start planning out the seasonal migration patterns of a homebrew pseudo-dragon subspecies that they'll probably never encounter. Another one that's definitely going into my campaign binder is the magic item tracker. I've always struggled with making sure that I'm giving my players magic items at the right pace and level. Being told, make sure they get 11 magic items by level 4 feels very abstract to me, and either I'll end up giving them too many too quickly and then not being able to give them any more for a long stretch, or they'll hit level 4 and I'll realize I've been way too stingy. This sheet is basically just a checklist sorted by character level and item rarity, so you can mark the items off as you go and have a clear visual of your progress. I think this is one of the most practical sheets they've provided, and I'm kind of kicking myself for not having created it for myself already, to be honest. Also, I haven't mentioned the silly little baby monsters on all these tracker sheets yet, but I can't not mention this one. This is a Neopet. Like, yeah, it's a Tressim, sure, but like, look at this and tell me that this isn't somebody's Fairy Kugra OC. Anyway, not every worksheet is useful. Some of them honestly feel like an excuse to just stick some baby monster art onto a blank sheet of lined paper and call it content. The campaign journal tracker, for example, is basically just their attempt at a structured page for session notes, but I can't see a world in which having 3 blank spaces for important events from earlier sessions, plans for this session, and additional notes is more useful to me than just having a sheet of lined paper. In the same way, the campaign conflicts sheet is worthless. It's literally just split into 3 sections, and each section says adventurers versus and then a bunch of blank lines. I get that they're trying to prompt DMs to think about their big story conflicts in a top-level way, but this just feels like a waste of space to me. Despite the ones that I don't love, I am a fan of these tracking sheets overall. To me, they speak to a DMG that's focused on providing tools and resources to make DMing easier. Even if you don't want to use these specific sheets, I think they have really useful information about what basic stuff you should be prepping and tracking as you run games. I really hope they'll be making these available as an easy little PDF download pack for printing, because it's the year of our Lord 2024 and nobody photocopies stuff anymore. In fact, I might be the weirdo for still printing stuff at all. Gen Z probably just yeets PDFs into the cloud or something. Before we talk encounter balance, please allow 60 seconds for my bank balance, courtesy of today's sponsor. Thanks for meeting with me. I was hoping you could take a look at our household budget. It just feels like we're always overspending.
You know that taping words to my shirt doesn't suddenly qualify me to be an accountant, right?
Sure. Here's our current spending. Any ideas?
Groceries, mortgage, utilities. Wait a second, is this a typo? Why does it say you spent $162 on dice?
Yeah, from Guild. It would have been more, but I used the code GinnyD to take 10% off my order. It's all 10 sets of damage dice.
This is completely unreasonable. You already have hundreds of dice. Why did you need these?
Fire damage dice. It's 20 dice, from D4s to D20s. For Fireball, Firebolt, Firestorm, Fire Shield, Flame Strike, Flaming Sphere.
And these?
Lightning damage dice. For Chain Lightning, Lightning Bolt, Shocking Grasp, you know. And Cold, for Ice Storm, Ray of Frost, Wall of Ice.
Okay, I get it, but why do you need different types of dice for different types of damage? Can't you just roll the same dice for everything?
But this way, I can roll Flame Strike damage all at once and know how much is Radiant and how much is Fire. Also, do you want me to live a gray and empty life without joy and whimsy? They even come in their own embroidered bags. Can't we find something else in the budget to cut?
Fine. How about this $200 a month on novelty earrings?
No, non-negotiable. How about groceries? If you asked me a week ago what my #1 request was for the new DM's guide, I would have said fix encounter balance. Well, more accurately, I would have fallen to my knees, tears streaming from my eyes, and pitifully begged for it. Please, I'm desperate. Please give us something even slightly more functional than what's in the 2014 DMG. In my experience, balancing encounters is one of the most difficult things for new DMs to learn. We're given a mathematical system and then simultaneously told that the system is flawed, and we need to somehow understand how any given monster stat block will apply to our specific party in order to ensure that we aren't throwing them into a death trap. I mean, a bandit captain and an intellect devourer are both CR2, but there's a huge difference between a baddie who can eat your brain and wear your corpse like a fancy suit within 2 turns, and a baddie who can hit you a couple times with a scimitar. Even now, with years of DMing under my belt, I still struggle with encounter balance. I have a bookmarks folder with countless resources designed to make it easier to create encounters that will appropriately challenge my players, but I constantly find myself running encounters that don't line up with my intentions. There are just so many factors in both player character builds and monster abilities, I'm not sure if it's even possible to design a system that can accurately predict how difficult an encounter will be. But hey, I'm not a game designer. I was really hoping that somebody smarter than me would be able to pull it off for this edition. I don't know yet if my prayers have been answered. They definitely changed encounter balance, I'm just not sure if it's fixed yet. First, they've changed up the numbers on the XP thresholds, which they're now calling your XP budget. They started by nixing the entire easy encounter column, so the new chart divides encounter difficulty into low, moderate, and high. The first 5 levels are identical to the 2014 levels, but after that they start scaling up. At first only by 100 XP or so, but by the time we hit 20th level, the XP budget for a deadly encounter has nearly doubled, from 12,700 to a whopping 22,000 XP. The other major difference here is that they've completely eliminated the encounter multipliers for the number of monsters. In the 2014 guide, if you had 2 monsters instead of 1, you were supposed to multiply their XP value by 1.5. 3 monsters, double it, and so on. That concept is completely absent in this new DMG. Instead, there's just a quick note that including more than 2 creatures per player character could get hairy. Between these 2 changes, what you end up with is a system that assumes characters are much more powerful than in 2014. With the last DMG, if you wanted to throw a deadly encounter at your party of 4 level 20 characters, you would have done the math and ended up with, say, a mating pair of adult green dragons. According to the 2024 table, you're gonna need those dragons to have welcomed another 5 adult green dragons into their polycule in order to be considered a high difficulty encounter. Also, this whole section has been cut down and just made a lot less intimidating. Where the 2014 guide had paragraphs describing the calculations you should be doing, the new DMG has cut all of that math in favor of general practical advice. There are example encounters demonstrating how the XP budget works, and some quick tips about things like adjusting encounters on the fly or how to use CR0 creatures. There are also some great little hacks to allow you to quickly judge how a monster's CR stacks up against the party. For example, if you want a low difficulty encounter, you can just grab a single monster whose CR matches the party's level. And if a monster's CR is higher than the party's level, you should assume that it's capable of one-shotting a character. I do think these changes are good, but it's tough to know if they've truly solved the problem until I've spent some time trying them out at the table. To be honest, I was kind of hoping for a big overhaul of the system, and instead, they basically just made encounters over level 5 harder. But of course, we have no idea what they've done with the monster manual, and that could play a big part in this as well. So to some degree, we just have to wait and see. And in the meantime, I'll stick to the bandit captain for my tier 1 players. Really freaks them out when they think they've won and then the intellect devourer crawls out of his skull. The next new addition might be a little controversial: ready-made game elements. Now, to be clear, this is not the first DMG to include specific game resources that DMs are encouraged to use. The 2014 DMG had a few pages of miscellaneous maps at the back, and the 2024 DMG does too. But they've taken this concept to another level by also including a handful of short adventures and a general overview of the Greyhawk setting, either for use in your own games or as a reference for what adventures and settings might look like. I'm really excited to see these elements included in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Those of you who watch my channel regularly know that I tend to include a lot of examples when I'm explaining a method or technique for DMs. And honestly, the main reason I do that is that I personally have an easier time understanding something if I have a clear example of it. You can tell someone how to put together an adventure, but it'll be easier if they've seen what an adventure typically looks like. The sample adventures in the DMG include examples of things like leaving room for non-combat solutions, using random tables and environmental effects, and how to create an engaging hook to get the party interested. It's all the stuff the previous chapter teaches you how to do put into practice. And you might say, that doesn't need to be in the DMG, you can just go look at a published module. And you're right, it's always been possible to use pre-written adventures and settings as references for your own creations. I do it all the time. But, and I know this may be shocking to hear for those of us whose RPG bookshelves would certainly deal enough bludgeoning damage to kill us if they fell over, a beginner DM might not have easy access to a published module. They're gonna have to get their bludgeoning damage somewhere else. Plus, what really struck me about the example adventures in the new DMG is that unlike many of the adventures in campaign modules, they're super simple. Out of the 5 example adventures, 4 of them are only half a page. Whereas if you pick up, say, Keys from the Golden Vault, you're gonna be looking at 10, 15, 20-page adventures. And that makes sense if you're selling it. You wanna offer people something complex that they can't or don't have time to create themselves. But the examples in this book look way more like my own home game prep than the adventures in modules do. And if I had seen adventure write-ups like this when I first started DMing, I think I would have found prep much less intimidating. Along those same lines, I typically find world building kind of overwhelming. A world is just so much content to create. Yeah, I could create a dozen unique kingdoms with hundreds of years of history in their own languages, as long as the campaign isn't starting until 2055. If I were a new DM and someone handed me the Eberron campaign setting book, it would be way too easy for me to assume that in order to create my own homebrew setting, I would need to literally write a 300+ page book. Seeing the whole Greyhawk setting laid out in 30 pages not only makes me feel like I could create a whole setting, but it also gives me a clear template for what a functional setting needs. I could literally flip through these Greyhawk pages, read the section about gods, create my own gods based on that, and feel confident that I had created everything I needed to actually use that pantheon in my game. Yes, it's always been possible to look at a published adventure or setting and reference them for making your own stuff. But I think the choice to put basic versions of these things into the DMG is a smart one, because it removes a barrier to new DMs finding these kinds of resources. And it's a great way to say, hey, here's what a regular old adventure looks like. You can go harder if you want, but this is also enough. By the way, I don't think this is just a resource for beginners either. There's an adventure for level 7 characters called The Boreal Ball, where the adventurers get invited to a fancy party in the Feywild. My first thought when I read it was, if I run this, and my players don't spend the first hour describing their characters wearing more rhinestones than a Eurovision performance, I have failed. But my second thought was, the next time I want to run a masquerade ball or any event like that, regardless of setting or theme, I can use this as a template. There's a short list of NPCs that could easily be replaced with your own, a simple mechanic for using renown to keep track of whether or not the party is making a good impression on those NPCs, a combat encounter, and a reward. Each of these adventures is so simple that they're ridiculously easy to reskin whenever you need a quick filler adventure or you're just out of ideas. Okay, I would argue that this next one is the biggest change to the Dungeon Master's Guide, and that is Bastions. A lot of these other changes are just improvements or edits to features that the DMG already had, but this is a brand new game mechanic. A Bastion is just a home base that each player character gets when they hit level 5. As you level up, you get to add features to your Bastion, like a library or a teleportation circle or a pub. When you're home or in contact with your Bastion, you can issue commands to provide in-game rewards and resources. For example, if you've hit 9th level and you have a greenhouse in your Bastion, you can visit anytime and pick 3 magical fruits that cast lesser restoration when eaten. And when you take a Bastion turn, you can issue the command to harvest and either receive a potion of greater healing or one of 4 types of poison. When you're away and out of contact with your Bastion, you roll on a table to see what happens while you're gone. Everything from your Bastion being attacked, to a friendly visitor stopping by, to finding out that one of your hirelings has a criminal past. So a lot like trying to find a good cat sitter. I think we can all agree that one of the main draws of games like D&D is that we can live out fantasies that are unrealistic in real life, like flying, doing magic, and now owning property. Not every party is going to be into this, and that's fine. It's easy enough to just ignore this chapter. But as someone who would love to play D&D like The Sims, I'm not gonna lie, I am really amped about this. My adventuring party has had a stronghold of some kind in every single game I've played in. But when there aren't mechanics or quantifiable rewards for having a home base, it can feel like a waste if you spend too much game time on it. So often we just end up using it as a storage space for treasure, vehicles, mounts, family members that we've rescued from demonic possession, you know, just regular stuff. By giving Bastions set mechanical effects and having clear rules for what they can include and how they can be expanded and improved, players like me now have an outlet for that domestic Stardew Valley-like impulse to build yourself a little fantasy home of your own. I do have one main concern about this, and that is the timing for Bastion turns. As written, you can take a Bastion turn once every 7 days. The book does acknowledge that this frequency might not work for every game and suggests that you can slow it down to once a month if that makes more sense. That is the opposite of my concern. Most of the games that I play tend to move at what I would lovingly call an excruciating crawl. Just for funsies, I went back through my session notes for one of my home games to see how long it had taken us to get through 1 week of in-game time. 11 months. Oh boy, can't wait to take my annual Bastion turn. I'm sure for most groups it isn't quite that extreme, but we can't be the only ones for whom a once-a-week Bastion turn would happen infrequently enough that we'd all forget what a Bastion is, right? I'm not sure if the solution is just learning to pick up the pace in games that include Bastions, or increasing the frequency of Bastion turns to daily or once every 2 or 3 days, or some combination of changes like that. But in my home games, this would definitely not work as written. I will also say, I think it's interesting that every player character gets their own Bastion. That surprised me when I first learned about this, because in every game I've played, the party has had a shared stronghold. And you can choose to combine your Bastion with one or more other players, and it all works the exact same way, except that you can now share defenders if any of the combined Bastions get attacked. But honestly, I can also see the benefit of having Bastions spaced out across the map so that your party has a safe place to go no matter what region they're in. Plus, if you have a cleric whose Bastion contains a sanctuary and a reliquary and is decorated with statues to venerate their god, and then you have a rogue whose Bastion contains a gaming hall, a pub, and a thieves guild hall, it probably doesn't make a ton of narrative sense for those to share a building. Or hey, maybe that's the only way to keep the rogue out of trouble, like having your youth pastor as your RA. Finally, the last of the big changes is at the very back of the book, the lore glossary. This is basically just a glossary of terms related to the lore and world of D&D. Important figures from history, locations, creatures, and items that a DM might need to know, with brief descriptions and some sometimes tips on where to find more information if you want it. The more obscure names also come with pronunciation guides, which I think is so smart. The way that D&D is played, we're speaking these names, even if we've never heard them aloud before. Let's say a player asks a blacksmith to craft them adamantine armor. You can check the glossary and see that this dark metal is found in meteorites, and then you can send the player off on a little quest to the kingdom where, rumor has it, a star recently fell right into the town square. Or maybe you have a group of orcs having a religious moment, and you realize very suddenly that you have no idea how the name of their god is pronounced. No worries, you can flip to the lore glossary and learn that it's Grumpsh. So cute. It's on my baby name list. I think this is a great idea because at this point there is decades of history associated with D&D, and there are plenty of things that you'd only know if you'd played very specific adventures, and even some that you'd only know if you'd played other editions entirely. Since I didn't come on board until 5th edition, there's no reason that I would know anything about, say, Odaluk, other than the fact that he was really into spears. Although, to be fair, that's most of his entry in the lore glossary too. This guy saw a ball once and was like, neat. I'm gonna make this my whole personality. The longer that D&D continues to grow and change and expand, the more different types of media are involved in creating and perpetuating the lore, the harder it's gonna get for a newcomer to understand everything that came before them. And if Wizards wants that lore to be more than just a Baldur's Gate 3 Easter egg, then they really do need to start actively educating people about it. Honestly, I think a glossary like this is long overdue for a property with as much history as D&D. I also really like the art in this section, mostly just because like 50% of these historical figures are portrayed as extremely hot. The Summer Queen, the Raven Queen, my girl Tasha. I'd never heard of the Prince of Frost before this, but now I'm pretty sure I could fix him. That joke would have landed so much better if I was allowed to show you the Prince of Frost art. You'll just have to trust me, that man does not skip leg day. I know I've been yammering about this for several business years, but I want to be really clear that this is by no means an exhaustive list of the changes. It honestly might have been easier to list the things that haven't changed. I think more than any one change to the rules or the writing, the biggest difference between this DMG and the one that came before it is the overall philosophy. The 2014 DM's Guide explicitly says that it isn't here to teach you the basics of DMing. It basically says if you don't already know how to DM, f off and get the starter set. Loser. But despite that warning, there is still so much content in that book that is clearly targeted at beginners, explaining what an encounter or a dungeon is, telling you when to call for an attack roll, defining advantage and disadvantage. On the other hand, this new DMG is very clear. It is a guide that teaches you to be a dungeon master. I know, risky choice for a book called The Dungeon Master's Guide, but I think it could pay off. Chapters 1 and 2 are specifically described as teaching the essentials of being a dungeon master. Instead of the 2014 guide strategy of defining a dungeon master and then diving headfirst into world building, this book starts by teaching you what materials you'll need, how to prep for sessions, and even includes a step-by-step walkthrough of what you can expect to happen on game night, from the recap all the way to how to end a session. And unlike the 2014 guide, the essential information on how to run games is right at the front, and the deeper stuff for DMs who already know the basics comes after. Of course, there is a lot of information in here that's more or less the same as the 2014 DMG. There's still a chapter about the planes, although it's 8 pages instead of 25, so I'm calling that a win. There are still pages and pages of magic items, most of which are the same. There are tons of repeated small sections like marks of prestige and poisons and renown, but all of it has been reorganized and received some much needed editing to make it more readable and concise. In the 2014 DMG, there is an entire page that is just about currency. In the new book, that has been reduced to 3 sentences. Frankly, I don't know how DMs are expected to do our jobs without knowing about the Platinum Harbor Moon with its Electrum inlay, which is worth 50 gold pieces in Waterdeep and 30 everywhere else, but I'm hoping that together we'll find a way. But in trade for everything they cut, they're offering us a ton more tips and resources for building essential Dungeon Master skills. For every random table that's been removed, we're getting a practical, broadly applicable lesson. How to keep effective notes throughout your campaign, how to keep combat from dragging, how to deal with players trying to exploit the rules. I don't love every single page or every single word, but I have to be honest, I think overall, I really like this DMG. It dedicates a lot of space to the soft skills of D&D that I've always centered on my channel that have been largely missing from the way that we talk about and teach this game. I mean, if it also included pop songs rewritten to be about D&D, you guys wouldn't even need me anymore. A few weeks ago, when I made a video about finally reading the 2014 DMG cover to cover after years of using it as a reference text, I got some comments that were like, can't believe you have the balls to advise others on how to run games when you haven't even read the whole DMG. Well, to be fair, those comments on average were a lot less articulate than that, but that was the gist. And even though real people tell me every day that my videos have helped them run better games and feel more confident in their DMing, it's hard not to let those kind of comments get to you a little. But reading this new Dungeon Master's Guide has been so validating. So much of the content in this book is stuff that I've been saying in videos for years. Advice on improvising, advice on role-playing, advice on table etiquette. Most of it wasn't in the 2014 DMG, but it was sure as in my videos, and it's in the new DMG because it is important and genuinely helps people have a better time at the D&D table. I suspect that if you really enjoy my channel, you will be more likely to enjoy this book. But as always, if you aren't sure, or you don't think you'll like it, or you just want a little more information, then you should wait. $60 is nothing to sneeze at, and if this book has a similar lifespan to the last one, you've got a decade to make up your mind. I'll be going more in depth on specific parts of this book in upcoming videos, so let me know in the comments what you want to learn more about. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go gaze at the Prince of Frost artwork and think about gender theory.